The candles in the great hall of Ravenshire House had burned low by the time Lady Amelia Everley slipped the folded letter beneath the door of the study, where Alexander, Duke of Ravenshire, kept his ledgers and his secrets. She did not knock. She did not allow herself even a moment to press her palm against the dark wood and imagine him on the other side, asleep in the chair by the fire, the way he so often was when duty kept him from his bed. She had rehearsed this moment for 3 days, and rehearsal had taught her that hesitation was the one luxury she could no longer afford. Outside, the November wind moved through the black hedges of the garden like something alive, searching. She drew her cloak tighter and did not look back at the house that had, for one golden season, felt as though it might belong to her. 6 days from now, that house would have opened its doors to the whole of the county for her wedding. The dressmaker had already delivered the gown. The invitations, thick with the Ravenshire seal, had already gone out to every family of consequence between London and the sea. And now she was leaving all of it behind in the dark, without a farewell, without an explanation that would not endanger the very man she was trying to save. She had told herself, walking down that gravel drive for the last time, that love was supposed to feel like arriving somewhere. No one had prepared her for how much it could feel, instead, like a slow and necessary vanishing. 3 days earlier, Amelia had been the happiest she had ever been in her life, and she had known it while it was happening, which made what came after so much crueler. She had stood in the rose garden at dusk, while Alexander read to her from a volume of poetry he pretended to find tedious and secretly loved, his voice low and unhurried, the last of the sun catching gold in his dark hair. He was not a man who gave his heart easily. She had watched him for 2 seasons before he had ever spoken more than pleasantries to her, watched him hold the whole weight of a dukedom on shoulders that never seemed to bend, watched him bury his grief for his father so completely that most of society believed him a man incapable of feeling anything at all. She alone had seen otherwise. She had seen him kneel in the mud outside the tenant cottages to examine a broken cartwheel himself, rather than send a servant. She had seen him sit for an hour beside an old groundskeeper's sickbed, saying nothing, simply present. She had seen the careful, deliberate way he unclenched his jaw before he spoke to her, as though determined that whatever darkness lived in him would never touch her. "You are thinking too hard again," he had said that evening in the garden, setting the book aside. "I can always tell. Your eyes go somewhere I cannot follow." "I was thinking that I do not deserve to be this happy," she had told him, and meant it more than he could have known. He had taken her hand then, turned it over, and pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist, with a tenderness that undid her every time. "You will have to become accustomed to it," he had said. "I intend to keep you this happy for the rest of your life, whether you believe you deserve it or not." She had smiled and let him believe the matter settled. She had not told him that a letter had arrived for her that very morning, sealed with no crest, written in a hand she did not recognize, containing 11 sentences that had rearranged the entire shape of her future. The letter had not threatened her. It had threatened him. It had described, with a precision that made her sick with fear, the exact carriage route Alexander took each Tuesday to inspect the northern tenant farms, the exact hour he rode alone without his guard because he disliked being watched, the exact bend in the road where a man might wait unseen among the trees. It had made no demands beyond one, that Lady Amelia Everley disappear from Alexander's life within the week, permanently, without explanation, and that she never attempt to contact him again in any way that might be traced. Should she fail to comply, or should she ever tell him the reason for her leaving, the letter promised that the Duke of Ravenshire would not live to see the spring. She had read it 7 times before she believed it was real, and by the 7th reading she had already begun, in some cold and practical part of her mind she had not known she possessed, to plan her disappearance. There was one further complication, one she had not yet confirmed even to herself when the letter arrived, though her body had been telling her for a fortnight. 3 days after the threat came, the physician she visited under a false name, in a part of London she had never before set foot in, confirmed what she already suspected. She was carrying Alexander's child. She sat afterward in the hired carriage, with her hands pressed to her still flat stomach, and wept, not from fear, though there was fear enough, but from a grief so enormous it seemed to have no bottom. She would not simply be leaving the man she loved. She would be leaving him without ever telling him he was to be a father, would be raising his child alone in hiding, would be denying them both the one thing that might have made this unbearable choice bearable to share. But sharing it was precisely what she could not do. If Alexander knew the truth, he would not run. He would not disappear quietly to keep her safe. He would go looking for whoever had threatened them, and in going looking, he would walk directly into the trap that had been laid for him. She had come to know him well enough in their courtship to understand this without doubt. His courage was not performance. It was simply who he was, and it would kill him. So she had done the only thing left to her. She had written a letter of her own, brief, cold, deliberately cruel in the way she knew would end things fastest and most completely. She had told him she had reconsidered their engagement. She had told him she did not love him as a wife ought to love her husband. She had told him not to look for her, and had signed it with a formality that would have been unthinkable between them a week before. She had known, sealing it, that she was handing him a wound that would take years to close, if it ever closed at all. She had known the kingdom would call her fickle, faithless, a woman who had used a duke's affection to elevate herself, and then abandoned him the moment something more appealing appeared. She had known her own family, what remained of it, would be shamed by association. She had known all of this, and she had done it anyway, because the alternative was a world in which Alexander Ravenshire did not exist in it at all, and that was a world she could not bring herself to create. Alexander found the letter the following morning, and for a long while he did not move from where he stood. He read it once, standing. He read it a second time, seated, because his legs had ceased, briefly, to hold him. He read it a third time, searching for some sentence, some word that might reveal itself as a code, a cry for help disguised as rejection, because nothing in the 11 months he had known Amelia, Everly had prepared him to believe she was capable of writing what the page in his hand plainly said. He had not been a man who believed in love easily. His father had died when Alexander was 26, and in the years before that death, he had watched his parents' marriage curdle slowly and silently into something that resembled two strangers occupying the same house, bound by duty and title and nothing else. He had grown into his role believing that love was, at best, an inconvenience a man of his position could not truly afford, and at worst, a lie people told themselves to make bearable the arrangements that duty required of them. Amelia had unmade that belief without seeming to try. She had argued with him about poetry and horses and the management of tenant land. She had refused to flatter him the way other young women of the ton had learned to do from the cradle. She had looked at him, the very first time they spoke at length, not as a duke but as a man, and asked him whether he was happy, a question so unexpected that he had laughed aloud in a ballroom for the first time in longer than he could remember. He had fallen in love with her slowly, deliberately, the way he did everything, and had believed, with the particular arrogance of a man who has never before been wrong about something that mattered, that she had fallen in love with him in the same way, and that what they had built between them was solid enough to withstand whatever life put in its path. The letter in his hand told him he had been a fool. He did not rage. Those who knew him would have expected fury, would have expected him to summon every resource at his disposal to hunt her down and demand an explanation. Instead, something in him simply went quiet, the way a house goes quiet when a fire in the hearth burns down to ash. He instructed his staff to say nothing of the matter, beyond confirming that the engagement had been ended by mutual understanding. He cancelled the wedding with a brevity that scandalized the vicar. He returned every gift he had given her, every letter she had sent him, in a single crate delivered to her family's townhouse, only to have it returned unopened 3 days later, because the house had already been let to new tenants, and no one could say where Lady Amelia Everly had gone. It was then, for the first time, that a small and unwelcome thought entered his mind, that perhaps she had not left him for another man at all, but had left because something had frightened her badly enough to erase herself entirely. He dismissed the thought as the desperate reasoning of a wounded pride, unwilling to accept plain rejection, and he did not allow himself to think it again for a very long time. He was wrong to dismiss it. He would not learn how wrong for almost exactly a year. The coastal village of Pharaoh's End had never, in its 400 years of quiet existence, seen a woman quite like the one who arrived there in the last week of November, carrying a single trunk and calling herself Mrs. Amelia Hart, a widow whose husband, she said, had been lost at sea. No one in Pharaoh's End had reason to doubt her. Widows arrived in fishing villages often enough, drawn by cheap lodging and the anonymity of a place too small to attract gossip from the wider world, and this one, though clearly gently bred beneath her plain wool gowns, kept to herself in a manner the village found not unfriendly but simply private, the way a wounded animal keeps to the shadows of a hedge until it has healed enough to be looked at. She took a small cottage at the edge of the village, near enough to the sea that she could hear it from her bed at night, a sound she found, in those early weeks, to be the only thing that quieted the panic that lived permanently beneath her ribs. She had brought with her what little money she could gather without drawing attention to herself, and she made it last by taking in mending, then later, when her condition made close work difficult, by helping the village midwife, a sharp-eyed, kind-handed woman named Old Ruth, who asked no questions Amelia did not wish to answer, and who became, in the months that followed, the closest thing to a friend Amelia allowed herself. She wrote no letters. She received none. She had cut every thread that might lead back to her former life, understanding that even the smallest carelessness, a letter to a childhood friend, a message to her old lady's maid, a moment's weakness in which she might have written simply to say, "I am alive, I am well, do not grieve me," could be the thread someone pulled to find her, and through her, to find Alexander. The winter was the hardest of her life. She had never in her 19 years gone without a warm fire or a full larder, had never darned her own stockings by candlelight because she could not afford more candles, had never known the particular fear of watching her coin purse grow lighter each week, with no certain way of refilling it. She learned. She learned the way desperate people always learn, quickly, and without the luxury of complaint, and by the time her son was born in the deep cold of late February, in a small room above the village apothecary's shop, with Old Ruth's steady hands guiding him into the world, Amelia Hart had become a woman entirely unrecognizable from the sheltered young lady who had once worried over the exact shade of ribbon that ought to trim a ball gown. She named him William, after no one, because she wanted him to belong to himself and not to the weight of a family history he could not yet understand. He had his father's eyes, dark and steady, and the moment Old Ruth placed him against her chest, Amelia understood with a certainty that frightened her how completely her heart had rearranged itself around this small, fierce, red-faced creature who knew nothing yet of the danger that had shaped his existence before he had even drawn breath. "He'll ask after his father one day," Old Ruth said gently, some weeks later, watching Amelia nurse the boy by the fire. "Children always do." "I know," Amelia said, and something in her voice made the older woman set down her mending and simply sit with her a while, saying nothing further, which was, Amelia would later think, one of the great kindnesses of that entire terrible year. She thought of Alexander every day, not in the abstract way one thinks of a closed chapter of one's life, but specifically, constantly. The particular way he laughed when something genuinely surprised him, low and short, as though laughter were a thing he had to give himself permission to release. The manner in which he read a room before he entered it, cataloging every person's mood before he had spoken a word. The way he had once, without being asked, ordered the household to leave a lamp burning in the east window each night, because Amelia had mentioned, only once, that she disliked returning to a dark house. She wondered whether he hated her now. She assumed he must. She had given him every reason to, had constructed her letter and her disappearance with exactly that outcome in mind, because a man who hated her would not spend his strength searching for her, and a man who did not search would not walk into whatever trap still waited for him in the dark. She told herself this was mercy. Some nights, rocking William by the dying fire, she was not certain she believed it. Spring came to Pharaoh's End slowly, the way it always seemed to along that stretch of coast, as though the sea itself were reluctant to release its grip on winter. Amelia found work mending nets for the fishing families, when her sewing arm had recovered enough to manage the coarse rope and heavier needle the work required, and though her fingers bled more often than she cared to admit in those early weeks, She came to find a strange comfort in the rhythm of it, the way it occupied her hands, while her mind wandered, inevitably, south, toward a house she had once believed would be her home. She kept William close in those months, carrying him bound against her chest as she worked, singing to him the same half-remembered lullabies her own mother had sung to her before illness took both her parents within a single terrible winter when Amelia was 12. She had not thought of her mother often in the years since, but motherhood had a way of resurrecting the dead in small, unexpected moments. The particular way she found herself humming a tune she had not consciously remembered knowing, the instinct to press her lips to William's forehead each time he startled awake crying, as though the gesture had been passed down to her like an inheritance she had not known she carried. There were nights that first spring when the loneliness pressed so heavily against her chest that she could not draw a full breath, when she sat by the window watching the moon over the water and allowed herself, briefly, to imagine writing to him. A single line, "He is well. I am well. Do not grieve us." She drafted such letters in her mind 100 times and burned every one before it ever touched paper, understanding that the smallest kindness she might offer Alexander in that moment could be the very carelessness that cost him his life. Old Ruth, who had by then become something between a friend and a second mother to her, found her once in just such a state, tears freezing nearly as fast as they fell, and did not ask what troubled her, only sat beside her on the cold step and took her hand. "Whatever it is you're running from," Ruth said eventually, "it must be a fearsome thing indeed, for a woman with your bearing to be darning nets in Pharaoh's End, rather than living the life your hands were clearly bred for." "I would rather darn nets for 100 years," Amelia had answered, "than see the alternative come to pass." Ruth had studied her for a long moment, the assessing look of a woman who had delivered half the village into the world and buried no small portion of it besides, and had seemed, in the end, to decide that whatever Amelia's secret was, it belonged to a good heart rather than a guilty one. "Then you'll do what needs doing," she said simply, same as the rest of us always have, and had never pressed the matter again, though her kindness toward Amelia only deepened in the months that followed, extending itself in small, unasked-for mercies, an extra portion of stew left at the cottage door on the hardest weeks, a length of warm wool quietly set aside from the parish charity box before anyone else could claim it, the kind of unspoken solidarity that women who have survived hard things sometimes extend to one another without ever needing to name what passes between them. William grew, as children do, with a speed that both delighted and unsettled Amelia, each new milestone a small private grief layered beneath the joy of it, because every step he took, every new word he babbled, was a moment his father would never know he had missed. She began, without quite deciding to, keeping a kind of silent record in her mind. The day he first smiled, the day he first reached for her face with both hands and laughed as though he had invented laughter himself, the particular stubborn set of his jaw when he was denied something he wanted, so precisely his father's that it made her breath catch every time she saw it, telling herself that if the day ever came when it was safe to tell Alexander everything, she would want to be able to give him back every moment he had lost, however imperfectly memory could restore them. She did not allow herself to believe, most days, that such a day would ever come. Hope, she had learned early in her exile, was a luxury that made the practical business of survival more difficult rather than less, and she trained herself instead toward a kind of quiet endurance, day folding into day, season into season, until nearly a year had passed, and the woman who arrived at Pharaoh's End as Lady Amelia Everley had become, in every practical sense that mattered, someone else entirely, someone harder, more capable, and in ways she could not have anticipated, more herself than the sheltered young lady who had once worried over ribbon. Alexander did not stop searching, though he told almost no one that he had not. Publicly, he allowed the story that suited everyone's comfort to take root. Lady Amelia Everley had jilted the Duke of Ravenshire for reasons known only to herself, likely another man of greater fortune or lesser scruple, and the Duke, wounded but proud, had resumed his duties with the stoic dignity expected of his rank. He attended the functions he was obligated to attend. He managed his estates with the same exacting care he always had. He did not, as society half expected, descend into the kind of public despair that would have given the gossip columns something new to feast upon. Privately, he employed a discreet investigator, a former Bow Street man named Josiah Gray, whom he paid handsomely and swore to absolute secrecy, and set him the task of finding any trace of where Amelia Everly had gone and why. It was not, Alexander told himself in the beginning, that he intended to beg her to return. It was that he could not accept a story with no explanation in it, could not simply file away 11 months of what he had believed to be genuine love as a performance staged for reasons he would never understand. He needed the truth, even if the truth confirmed the worst of what he already believed. Gray's early reports told him little. Amelia had left no trail from London, no coach hired in her name, no ship's manifest, no correspondence with family or friends that anyone would admit to. Her own relations, a widowed aunt of modest means who had served as her chaperone, seemed genuinely as baffled by her disappearance as anyone, and grief-stricken besides, which struck Alexander, on the rare occasions he permitted himself to consider it, as an odd thing for a woman to be if her niece had simply run off to a better prospect. It was nearly 4 months into the search, in the depths of winter, that Gray brought him something that changed the shape of Alexander's understanding entirely, though its significance would not become clear for some time yet. A stable boy who had once worked at the Everly townhouse, dismissed when the household closed up, recalled a strange visitor who had called at the house twice in the weeks before Lady Amelia's disappearance. A tall man, in a plain dark coat, who gave no name, and asked to see Lady Amelia alone, and who was, on both occasions, shown into the drawing room by Amelia herself, rather than announced through the usual channels, as though she had been expecting him and wished the meeting kept quiet from the rest of the household. Alexander turned this fact over for weeks like a stone in his pocket, worn smooth by handling. A secret visitor, a woman who arranged to see him unannounced, who ensured no servant overheard what passed between them. It was, on its face, precisely the sort of detail that would support the story he had told himself to believe, that Amelia had taken a lover, that the man in the dark coat was the reason for everything that followed. And yet something in him, some instinct he could not entirely silence, refused to settle comfortably into that explanation. He had known Amelia's face too well, had learned to read the smallest shifts in it, and try as he might, he could not conjure a version of her capable of the particular, calculated deception such an affair would have required, not while she sat beside him in the garden, speaking of their future with what he would have sworn, on his father's grave, was genuine and undivided tenderness. He did not share this doubt with anyone, save once, and even then only by accident. His younger sister, Lady Charlotte Ravenshire, newly married and still sharp-eyed enough to notice what the rest of society overlooked in her brother's carefully maintained composure, cornered him in the library one evening in early spring, some months after Amelia's disappearance, and refused to leave until he had answered her honestly. "You are not grieving her the way a man grieves a woman who wronged him," Charlotte said, settling into the chair across from his desk, with the particular immovable determination she had possessed since childhood. "You are grieving her the way one grieves a mystery. I have watched you do accounts for 3 hours without touching your brandy, which for you, brother, constitutes a kind of madness. I am managing an estate, Charlotte, not composing sonnets. You are managing an estate because it is the only thing left to you that makes sense," she said, not unkindly. "I am not asking you to weep in front of me. I am asking whether you truly believe Amelia Everly ran off with some fortune-hunting cavalry officer, as the gossips insist, or whether some other part of you suspects something considerably stranger." Alexander had set down his pen at that, turning the question over with the same care he gave to any problem he did not wish to answer carelessly. "I do not know what I believe," he admitted finally, which was, for a man who prided himself on certainty, as close to confession as he could manage. "I only know that nothing in the woman I courted for 11 months resembled the woman who wrote that letter. Either I understood her less than I believed, which is possible, or something happened to her that I do not yet understand, which frightens me considerably more." Charlotte had not pressed him further that evening, but she had, in her own quiet way, become an ally in the search he refused to formally acknowledge. passing along fragments of gossip she gathered at the functions Alexander himself avoided, asking careful questions of women who had once counted Amelia among their intimate circle, watching for any thread that might, pulled gently enough, lead somewhere useful. It was Charlotte, in fact, who first suggested that the strange visitor in the plain dark coat might be worth investigating not as a lover but as a threat, a possibility that had not occurred to Alexander until his sister voiced it aloud one evening, with the blunt clarity she had never lost, whatever else marriage and society had smoothed from her. "You assume because you are a man, and were wounded as a man is wounded, that the explanation must involve another man," she said. "Consider, brother, that a woman capable of loving you as thoroughly as she seemed to might also be capable of a sacrifice you have not yet imagined." He did not forget the observation, though months would pass before its truth became plain to him. He kept Gray's inquiries alive through the spring and into the summer, quietly, patiently, the way a man tends a fire he is not yet ready to admit he still needs. And he kept Charlotte's words folded away in some private compartment of his mind, returning to them in his darkest hours, the way one returns to a single candle in an otherwise unlit room. The year turned again toward winter, and with it came the anniversary Amelia had been dreading, without allowing herself to name it. The week that would have held her wedding, now marking instead a full year of hiding, a full year of watching William grow from a red-faced infant into a solemn, dark-eyed boy who had recently begun testing his legs against the furniture with the fierce concentration of a child determined to master the world on his own terms. She had begun, in recent months, to allow herself the smallest measure of hope that the danger might have receded, that whoever had threatened Alexander's life had perhaps moved on to other schemes, other targets, and that her continued exile might no longer be strictly necessary. She had no way of confirming this. She had cut herself off too thoroughly from any source of information about the wider world, about Alexander, about whatever forces had been arrayed against them, to know anything beyond what small news reached Pharaoh's End through traveling merchants and the occasional outdated London paper wrapped around a parcel of goods. It was one such paper, 3 months old by the time it reached her, that told her Alexander remained unmarried, still holding the title alone, still, according to a brief and cruelly speculative society column, a duke without a duchess, the wounds of his broken engagement apparently slow to heal. She had read the line perhaps 30 times before folding the paper away, unable to decide whether it brought her comfort or fresh grief. He was alive. He was, as far as any public record could tell her, safe. That was the whole of what she had sacrificed everything to secure, and she reminded herself of it fiercely every time loneliness threatened to convince her the price had not been worth paying. She did not yet know that the very stillness she had mistaken for safety was, in truth, only the quiet of a predator who had simply grown more patient. The blow came without warning, as such things always do. A man had begun asking questions in the village, not overtly, not in a manner that would have alarmed anyone less practiced than Amelia had become at reading danger in small details, but asking nonetheless, at the inn, at the smithy, about a young widow with a small son who might have arrived in the past year or two. Old Ruth heard of it first and came to Amelia's cottage with her face drawn tight with worry. "He's not from around here," Ruth said. "City clothes beneath a farmer's coat that doesn't fit him. Ask Tom at the smithy whether any strangers had settled nearby with a boy under 2 years. Tom told him nothing, bless him, but he'll not be the only one asked, and not everyone in this village loves you enough to lie for you." Amelia did not sleep that night. She sat by the window with William asleep against her shoulder, watching the dark road that led into the village, and understood with a cold and total clarity that her year of careful hiding had reached its end. Whoever had threatened Alexander's life had found her, or was close enough to finding her that the distinction hardly mattered. She had 2 choices, as far as she could see them in the exhausted small hours before dawn. She could run again, deeper into obscurity, taking William somewhere even more remote, even more difficult to trace, a strategy she had already begun, in the back of her mind, to doubt could work forever, not with a growing child, not with resources as thin as hers had become. Or she could do the one thing she had sworn a year ago never to do, and go to Alexander directly, trusting that whatever danger existed, it might be better fought together than endured apart. She chose to run, in the end, because a year of fear had taught her caution above all else, and because the thought of walking back into Alexander's life, of watching his face when he understood what she had done and why, of risking his safety on the strength of her own judgment, when her judgment had already cost them a year apart, was more than she could bear to weigh against her son's life. She left Pharaoh's End 4 days later, before dawn, with William bundled against the cold and every coin she had left in the world. She did not know, setting out on the coastal road with no clear destination beyond a way, that a winter storm was building over the moors she would have to cross, or that the man who had been asking questions in the village was not, in fact, an agent of the conspiracy that had haunted her for a year, but something else entirely, a complication that would alter everything she believed she understood about the danger she was fleeing. She only knew that she was afraid, and that she was alone, and that somewhere behind her, unbeknownst to either of them, the road she had chosen would, within 2 days, cross paths with the one man in England she had spent a year training herself never to seek. Alexander had ridden out from Ravenshire that week for reasons that felt, in retrospect, very much like fate arranging itself with a patience he had not credited it for. A tenant dispute in the northern reaches of the county, near the coast, had required his personal attention, a boundary disagreement between two families that his steward had failed to resolve and that threatened to fester into something uglier if left unaddressed. He had traveled with a smaller escort than usual, impatient to settle the matter and return south before the weather turned, and had very nearly succeeded, the dispute resolved to reasonable satisfaction on a gray Tuesday afternoon, when the storm that had been building over the moors broke early and with a violence that forced his party to seek shelter rather than press on toward home. It was during a lull in that storm, riding ahead of his men to scout a safer route through the drifting snow that had begun to choke the coastal road, that Alexander saw what he first took to be a fallen branch at the roadside, dark against the white, and rode closer only because something about its shape troubled him. It was a woman, collapsed at the base of a stone wall, her cloak spread wide in what he understood, even before he had fully dismounted, to be a desperate attempt to shield something beneath her from the wind and snow. He was off his horse and at her side before conscious thought caught up with instinct, pulling back the edge of frozen wool to find, curled against the woman's chest, a small boy, blue-lipped but breathing, whimpering weakly against a cold that had nearly claimed them both. "She's alive," he called back to his men, already stripping off his own greatcoat to wrap around the child, his hands moving with the efficient calm he brought to every crisis, even as something in his chest had gone tight and strange. It was only when he turned the woman gently onto her back, brushing snow from a face gone pale and still, that the ground beneath him seemed to tilt entirely off its axis. It was Amelia. A year older, thinner than he remembered, her once soft hands roughened by labor he could not yet account for, but unmistakably, impossibly, Amelia, the woman he had spent 360-some days trying, and failing, to stop loving, lying half-frozen in a ditch with a child in her arms who had, Alexander realized with a jolt that seemed to stop his heart entirely, his own eyes. He did not remember giving the order to ride for the nearest shelter. He did not remember the 2 miles that followed, Amelia limp against his chest, the boy wrapped in his coat and held against Josiah Gray's saddle, though Gray had not in fact been present, and it would only be days later that Alexander understood he had confused the desperate ride with older memories, so thoroughly had shock scrambled his sense of time. He remembered only the farmhouse they reached, the fire built high, the farm wife who took one look at the state of them and began issuing orders with the brisk authority of a woman who had seen death close enough not to waste time being delicate about avoiding it. He remembered sitting beside the bed where they laid Amelia, refusing to leave even when propriety and his own men suggested he might, watching color slowly return to her face, and thinking, with a clarity that frightened him, that whatever explanation she gave him when she woke, he was no longer certain he wanted the one he had spent a year convincing himself was true. Amelia woke to firelight and the particular ache of a body that has been colder than it was ever meant to be, and for a long, disoriented moment, did not understand why the face bent over her, drawn tight with a concern she had not expected to see directed at her ever again, belonged to Alexander Ravenshire. Then memory returned in a rush that stole what little breath she had recovered. The storm, the road, William slipping from consciousness against her chest as her own strength failed, and the terror of understanding that she had, in trying to save him from one danger, very nearly delivered them both to another. "William," she said, her voice a ruined thing, and tried to sit up too quickly, the room tilting alarmingly. "He's safe," Alexander said, and something in the low, controlled steadiness of his voice told her he had said this already, more than once, anticipating exactly this panic. Warmed and fed and sleeping by the kitchen fire, the farm wife has 3 children of her own. She knows what she's about. He paused, and when he spoke again, the steadiness had a crack in it he could not quite smooth over. "He has your chin, and my eyes, unless I am very much mistaken, which I do not believe I am." Amelia said nothing. There was, she understood in that moment, no version of the truth left to withhold. A year of careful silence, of sacrifice, measured out in small daily denials, had ended the instant Alexander Ravenshire's hands had pulled her cloak back from a sleeping child's face. "Alexander." His name felt strange in her mouth after a year of not saying it aloud. "I can explain. I need you to understand that I never—" "Not yet," he said, and the gentleness in it undid her more than anger would have. "You are half frozen, and you have clearly not slept or eaten properly in some time, judging by how little of you there currently is to freeze. Whatever you have to tell me will keep until morning. It has kept a year already." He hesitated, and she watched him war visibly with himself before he added, quieter, "I only need to know one thing tonight, and then I will let you rest. Were you running from me, Amelia? Or were you running from something else entirely?" She looked at him for a long moment, at the face she had memorized in a garden a lifetime ago, now carved a little sharper by a year of grief he had clearly not permitted himself to show the world, and felt the last of her careful defenses give way. "I was running to save your life," she said. "I have never, for one single day, stopped loving you." Something moved across his face then, that she had no name for, not quite relief, not quite grief, some complicated country between the two, that she suspected he would need a long time to fully map. He did not reach for her, though she saw the impulse in the way his hand curled against his knee before he mastered it. Whatever remained unresolved between them, he seemed to understand, could not be settled with a single confession, however long awaited. "Then you will tell me everything," he said, "and I will tell you that I never stopped searching. And in the morning, we will decide together what is to be done about whoever believes they still have the right to threaten us." For the first time in a year, Amelia allowed herself to weep, without also having to be strong for someone else in the same breath, and Alexander sat with her through the worst of it, saying nothing, simply present, exactly as he had once sat beside a dying groundskeeper, because some grief does not require words so much as it requires witness. The full truth emerged slowly over the days that followed, not because Amelia meant to withhold any part of it any longer, but because the telling itself required a strength she had to gather in pieces. She told him of the letter with no crest, of its exact and terrible knowledge of his Tuesday rides north, of the choice it had presented her with such surgical precision that she had never once doubted its author possessed the means to carry out the threat. She told him of the physician's confirmation that had arrived within the same week, of the decision she had made in a single sleepless night to disappear before either fact could be discovered by anyone with reason to use them against him. She told him of Pharaoh's End, of old Ruth, of a year spent mending strangers' clothes and fearing every unfamiliar face on the village road. Alexander listened to all of it with a stillness that frightened her more than shouting would have, and when she finished, he was silent long enough that she began to fear the silence meant something she could not bear to name. "Show me the letter," he finally said, "if you kept it." She had kept it, folded small inside the lining of her trunk, carried through every mile of her exile like a wound she refused to let heal wrong. He read it twice in the flat, careful voice of a man committing every word to permanent memory, and when he looked up, something in his expression had gone cold, in a way she had never before seen directed at anything but a genuine enemy. "I know this hand," he said quietly. You cannot, Amelia said. There is no signature, no seal. There is a turn of phrase, Alexander said, in the final line that I have seen before, in correspondence regarding my father's estate, from a solicitor my family has employed for 11 years, Edmund Ray. He set the letter down with a care that seemed at odds with the fury visibly building beneath his composure. My father warned me of him once, near the end, when his mind was already beginning to fail him in other ways. He told me never to trust a man who manages another man's fortune more carefully than his own conscience. I believed it the confusion of a dying man. I did not think to investigate further. It took another fortnight of careful, quiet inquiry, Josiah Gray proving his worth many times over, to uncover the full shape of what Edmund Ray had built over more than a decade of trusted service to the Ravenshire family. Ray had, it emerged, spent years quietly diverting portions of the family's northern holdings into shell arrangements that obscured his own growing ownership of land that ought to have remained entirely under Ravenshire control, a fraud so patient and so meticulously concealed that only a full audit of records going back to Alexander's grandfather's time revealed its true scope. Alexander's father, in his final failing months, had apparently begun to suspect the deception, which explained the warning he had given his son, and never lived to explain further. Ray's fear, once the audit began to close in on him, had not been of Alexander alone. It had been of the marriage, of a Duchess of Ravenshire, bringing her own family's connections and her own sharp intelligence into the household, doubling the eyes that might eventually catch what he had spent a decade hiding. He had gambled that removing Amelia would delay the wedding indefinitely, buy him time to complete one final, larger transfer of stolen land before slipping quietly out of England entirely, his crime undiscovered. He had never intended to actually harm Alexander, Gray's investigation eventually revealed. The threat had been calculated theater, built on a careful study of exactly what would frighten a devoted young woman into disappearing without a fight. It had worked precisely as designed, at a cost to two innocent people and a child that Ray had never once, in all his careful planning, troubled himself to consider. The revelation, when it finally came, did not bring Amelia the relief she might once have expected. Instead, it brought a different kind of grief, the understanding that a year of terror, of poverty, of a child born into hiding, had been built not upon a genuine mortal danger, but upon a lie, constructed by a man protecting nothing more sacred than his own theft. I am so sorry, Alexander said, when the full truth had been laid before them both, that a man in my own employ, a man my father trusted, cost you a year of your life, and nearly cost William his. You have nothing to apologize for, Amelia said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. You did not write that letter. You spent a year searching for me, when the whole of society told you to let me go. If there is a debt between us, Alexander, I do not believe it runs in the direction you seem to think it does. In the weeks that Gray's investigation quietly gathered its evidence against Ray, Alexander insisted that Amelia and William remain at Ravenshire, in rooms of their own, well removed from any lingering question of impropriety, guarded discreetly by men he trusted absolutely, and told nothing beyond the necessity of vigilance. It was, he explained, both a matter of their safety and a matter, though he did not say this part aloud at first, of his own inability to imagine either of them out of his sight again, so soon after nearly losing them both to a snowstorm. Amelia had expected in those first days some measure of awkwardness between them, the strange etiquette of two people who had once been promised to each other and were now neither strangers nor quite what they had been before. She found instead that Alexander approached her with a deliberate, unhurried patience that undid her more thoroughly than any grand declaration could have. He did not press her for details of the hardest months of her exile beyond what she offered freely. He did not treat William's existence as a debt to be immediately and formally corrected through hasty marriage, however much both of them privately understood that marriage was where matters were tending. Instead, he simply began, day by day, to make himself present in ways both large and small, as though rebuilding a house not by tearing down what remained of the old foundation, but by adding, carefully, room by room, to what had somehow survived. He came each morning to the small breakfast room where she took her meals with William, and though the first weeks passed with conversation that stayed carefully to safe subjects, the weather, the boy's evident fascination with the stable cats, the progress of the investigation, she began to notice, with a warmth she had not expected to feel again so soon, the particular way his gaze softened whenever William did something unremarkable and delightful, a spoon dropped with great ceremony, a single triumphant step taken unaided across the nursery floor. "He does not yet know I am his father," Alexander said one such morning, watching William attempt, with fierce concentration, to feed a piece of bread to a cat who had shown no interest whatsoever in receiving it. "I find I do not know how to tell him. I have given orations before the Royal Council with less anxiety than I feel contemplating that particular conversation." "He is not yet 2, Amelia said gently. "He will not understand the words so much as he will understand your presence. Be patient with him, and he will come to know you the way children always know the people who choose to stay." Alexander had looked at her then with an expression she remembered well from their courtship a lifetime ago, the particular stillness that came over him when something moved him more deeply than he was prepared to say aloud. "I intend to stay," he said simply, "for as long as either of you will permit me to." It was in the small accumulation of such mornings, such quiet, unremarkable hours, that the two of them began to find their way back toward each other. Not the same two people who had parted in grief and confusion a year before, but two people reshaped by hardship and separation into versions of themselves that fit together, Amelia found, with an ease that surprised her. She had feared, in her loneliest nights at Pharaoh's End, that even if some miracle returned her to him, the year between them would stand forever, as a wound too deep to fully close. Instead, she found that shared suffering, honestly reckoned with, had a way of deepening intimacy rather than merely scarring it, that Alexander's patience in those weeks taught her more about the man he had become than any number of poetry readings in a rose garden ever could have. There were harder moments too, inevitable ones. An evening when Amelia, exhausted and still not fully recovered from a year of scarcity, snapped at a servant over some trivial matter and then wept afterward, mortified, in a manner that had nothing to do with the servant and everything to do with a year of grief she had not yet allowed herself to properly release. Alexander found her in the garden that night, sat beside her without demanding explanation, and simply waited until she was ready to speak, exactly as he had that first night by the fire at the farmhouse. "I do not know how to be gentle with myself," she confessed eventually. "I forgot how, I think, somewhere in that year. Everything became about surviving each day, and there was no room left for anything softer." "Then let me be gentle with you," Alexander said, "until you remember how to be gentle with yourself again. I am, if nothing else, a very patient man. My tenants will attest to it, tediously, at length if you ask them." She had laughed then, surprising herself, and something in her chest had loosened that had been clenched tight for the better part of a year. The days before Ray's apprehension were not without their own danger, and Alexander would later admit to Amelia that he had come closer than he wished to confessing than to losing his composure entirely during the final confrontation that preceded the man's arrest. Warned by some remaining contact within the council that the audit into his affairs had accelerated beyond what he could outrun, Ray had come to Ravenshire House himself, under cover of a social call, ostensibly to offer condolences on the unfortunate rumors surrounding the Duke's household, and had instead attempted, in the privacy of the very study where Amelia's farewell letter had once waited beneath the door, to negotiate his own escape. "You will find," Ray had said, seated across from Alexander with a composure that might have been admirable had it not been so thoroughly monstrous, "that men in my position rarely act alone, and rarely without insurance. Should any unfortunate accident befall me before I have safely quit England, certain documents in the possession of certain associates will find their way to newspapers considerably less discreet than the council's own proceedings. Documents concerning your father's final years, concerning debts he did not wish known. I would think carefully, Your Grace, before deciding how swiftly justice ought to move in my case." Alexander had listened to the threat with a stillness that later frightened even him to recall, understanding in that moment precisely how a desperate and cornered man might have once terrified Amelia into vanishing, not through any grand violence, but through the quiet, surgical application of exactly the fear most likely to paralyze. He had thought of Amelia in that instant, of a year stolen from both of them by a threat that had, in the end, been theater built on precisely this kind of calculated cruelty, and something in him had gone very cold and very clear. You threatened my life once already, through a woman who loved me enough to disappear rather than risk it, Alexander had said, his voice carrying none of the heat Ray had perhaps expected and hoped to provoke. I find, having survived that threat, and the year of grief it cost us both, that I am considerably less afraid of you than you appear to require me to be. Take your documents to whatever newspaper will have them. My father's failings, whatever they were, are his own to answer for, not yours to wield. But you will not leave this house believing you have frightened me into silence a second time. He had risen then, crossing to the door himself rather than summoning a servant. Josiah Gray has been outside this study for the better part of your visit, Mr. Ray, along with 2 men from Bow Street who have been considerably more patient than I would have managed in their position. I would suggest you save whatever remains of your dignity for the magistrate. Ray had been apprehended at a Dover inn 3 weeks later, attempting to board a ship for the continent with a strong box of falsified deeds and a considerably smaller fortune than a decade of theft ought to have afforded him, most of it already spent, maintaining the appearance of the modest, trustworthy solicitor he had spent years pretending to be. The scandal that followed rocked the Royal Council itself, several of whose members had unknowingly relied on Ray's counsel in matters that, upon closer examination, revealed similar patterns of quiet, patient fraud stretching back further than anyone had suspected. Alexander testified before the magistrate with the same controlled precision he brought to everything, and the story that emerged in the press bore no resemblance to the one that had followed Amelia's disappearance a year before. She was not, the newly informed Tun now understood, a faithless woman who had abandoned a duke for a wealthier prospect. She was a woman who had sacrificed a year of comfort and reputation and family to protect the man she loved from a threat she had every reason to believe was real, and who had raised his son alone in poverty rather than risk exposing him to danger through even a single letter. The same drawing rooms that had once whispered her name with scorn now spoke it with something closer to awe, though Amelia found she cared considerably less about their good opinion than she once might have, having learned, in a year of genuine hardship, precisely how little society's approval was worth, measured against a child's safety. What mattered far more to her was the slow, careful rebuilding that took place between herself and Alexander in the months that followed. Not a resumption of where they had left off, for too much had changed in both of them for that to be honest, but something new, built with the particular patience of 2 people who understood now exactly how much they stood to lose. He did not rush her. He did not assume that a year of separation, however nobly intended, could be undone by a single confession and a public vindication. Instead, he courted her again, in earnest, the way he had the first time, small conversations that stretched into long ones, quiet walks through the gardens with William toddling ahead of them on legs that grew steadier every week, evenings by the fire where he read to her again from the same volume of poetry, his voice roughened now, she thought, by everything they had both survived. I have missed this, she told him one evening in early spring, William asleep in the nursery that Alexander had, without asking her permission, quietly begun furnishing the week after their rescue, as though there had never been any question of where the boy belonged. I did not allow myself to miss it, for a long time. It felt like a luxury I had forfeited the right to. You forfeited nothing, Alexander said. You gave up everything you had, believing it would save my life. I do not know that I have ever, in my entire life, been loved so completely by anyone. He took her hand then, the same gesture he had made in the rose garden a lifetime ago, and pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist. I told you once that I intended to keep you happy for the rest of your life, whether you believed you deserved it or not. I find I intend that still, if you will permit me to try again. The weeks between Ray's conviction and the wedding passed in a manner Amelia would later remember as the gentlest of her life, a slow unspooling of ordinary happiness she had once feared she would never again be permitted to claim. She spent long mornings in the Ravenshire gardens teaching William the names of flowers he promptly forgot, and then triumphantly misremembered. spent quiet evenings with Alexander in the library, where he had once read her poetry, and now read to her again, his voice steadier now, unhurried by grief. Charlotte, delighted beyond measure to finally understand the mystery she had sensed circling her brother for a year, took to Amelia with an enthusiasm that bordered on fierce, declaring within a fortnight of their proper introduction that she had always known, whatever the gossip said, that her brother was not fool enough to love a woman unworthy of it. There remained, even amid such happiness, a tenderness in Amelia that she suspected might never fully fade, a habit of checking still that William was within sight, a wariness around strangers that a year of hiding had etched into her more deeply than she had realized, until she caught herself, one afternoon in the village near Ravenshire, instinctively drawing William closer at the approach of an unfamiliar man who turned out to be nothing more than a traveling clockmaker seeking directions. Alexander, walking beside her, had noticed and had said nothing to diminish the moment, only taken her hand and matched his pace to the wariness in hers until it passed. "It will not always feel like this," he told her that evening, when she confessed, embarrassed, how quickly fear still rose in her at unexpected moments. "But I do not think it unreasonable that it takes time to feel safe again, after a year of teaching yourself not to. I would rather you take as long as you need than pretend a swiftness you do not feel." It was, Amelia thought, exactly the kind of patience she had come to depend upon in him, the same steady, unhurried strength that had once made her fall in love with him across 2 seasons of careful watching, and that had now carried them both through a year of separation and a season of careful rebuilding, without once demanding that either of them heal faster than their wounds allowed. Their wedding, when it finally came that summer, was smaller than the one that had been planned 2 years before, held not in the grand cathedral originally intended, but in the small stone chapel at Ravenshire itself, its ancient windows filling the space with the soft gold light of a July afternoon, the scent of the roses Amelia had insisted upon carrying, drifting faintly through air still cool with morning. It was attended only by those who had earned the right to witness it. Old Ruth, brought down from Pharaoh's End at Amelia's insistence, and seated in a place of honor she found alternately thrilling and mortifying, dressed in her Sunday best, and dabbing determinedly at her eyes throughout. Josiah Gray, whose discretion had proven as valuable as his diligence, standing near the back in a coat that fit him rather better than the disguises his work usually required. Charlotte, radiant with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been right about something important and was not above quietly reminding her brother of it. And William, not yet 2, solemnly presented with a small velvet cushion he was meant to carry the rings upon, and instead spent the ceremony attempting to eat, to the barely contained amusement of every guest present. Alexander watched his son's determined assault on the ring cushion with the particular helpless fondness that had, in the months since the snowbound road, become the truest measure of how completely his life had reshaped itself around the family he had once believed lost to him forever. And when he turned back to Amelia, standing before him in a gown considerably simpler than the one that had waited, unworn, in a dressmaker's shop 2 years before, he found he could not remember, for the life of him, what unhappiness had ever felt like. "No more vanishing," he murmured, for her ears alone, as the vicar cleared his throat to begin. "No more vanishing," Amelia agreed. "Only this, only forward." And outside the small stone chapel, the English summer moved warm and unhurried through the gardens, where 2 years before, a young woman had once believed herself happier than she deserved to be, and had been entirely, wonderfully wrong.